Hi everyone, I'm Kieran and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be creating another vintage candy bucket, and if you missed the cat one that I made last year, be sure to check out the video and there's a link to it up here. Or there. Not sure. To start, I wanted to add some really good detail to the face. I knew I wanted really big cheeks and a little nose, so I found these plastic play balls and decided to cut them in half because they weren't quite thick enough, and hot glued them inside to each other so they were more sturdy. I added hot glue around the edges and popped them on to make some cheeks. I also found a little smaller one and made a nose. Once I had the face, I wanted to add a bit of a cartoon ghost quiff, a bit like Casper or something like that, but on his head. So I took some tin foil, scrunched it up, shaped it as best as I could, and placed it on. Once tinfoil is wrapped in plaster bandage, it's actually really strong and really sturdy, and this tinfoil is a great way of adding sculptural details without having to build up all those layers and weight of plaster bandages. Once I had it roughly where I wanted it, I added some hot glue just to hold it in place until it was wrapped in the bandage. Next, it's time to chop up your plaster bandage. You can get these on Amazon, but I get mine from the range. Any version will work. I think the ones I've used most recently are Mod Rock, and they were quite good. You can just cut them up into strips, and I just use a pair of old scissors, and I like to cut the whole piece up, and I have mixture of lengths around 2 to 4 inches. In my last video, quite a few of you said that I made sculpting the cat look easy, but actually it is easy. It's very straightforward to do, and plaster bandages are very forgivable. They set within about 10 to 15 minutes, and during that time you can really refine the shapes and the details. It's also super inexpensive and a really good way to start crafting. But my number one top tip when sculpting is to set yourself a limit. You can only work on that one area during that session. When you walk away from it, it has to stay as it is, because I often find that if I go back and start tweaking later on, it never looks any better. So try the one sit method where you just do that piece, walk away and leave it alone and see how you get on. Before I start sculpting any of the details, I like to wrap the whole piece in a base layer of plaster bandage. For this I use some warm water, which is a lot nicer on your hands and also helps to smooth it out a lot more. As you finish with an area, sometimes you can see the weave of the plaster bandage. If you just wet your finger and rub it over, it will close that weave up with all of the excess plaster and create a much more smooth finish. With the base layer now on, it's time to start sculpting the details, and this is where the character really comes to life. I have a rough idea of the shape that I'm going for, but I don't know exactly what I'm going to do. Later on, I start to draw on the details of the eyes to give myself a shape, but I didn't stick to it, I changed it as I went. But on the cat one, I did mock that out in a lot more detail and followed that pattern through, so you can do what works best for you. When sculpting the details, I like to start with the most simplest section, and so for this it was the mouth. I knew that I wanted him to have a round mouth, almost like he was shouting boo, and so I cut various lengths of plaster bandage and just created that round shape. Over the period of sort of 10 minutes, that plaster bandage will set up, and you can see it just gets more and more refined as that plaster begins to harden off. Now, sculpting eyes and symmetrical things where there's going to be multiple of them on the same piece can be quite difficult. So for this, I try and remember what size lengths of plaster bandage I used, how I twist them, how I apply them, and things like that. This helps me when I come to do the second one, as it's much more consistent. But I also don't worry about it being exactly symmetrical. These eyes were a little bit different, but in terms of the overall piece, it all comes together towards the end. Once the eyes were in place, I decided that they needed some eyebrows, so I popped those on towards the end. Once you've finished sculpting, the finish can be a little bit bumpy, so you can smooth that out really easily with some sandpaper, and for this I was just using a mix of 220 and 240 grit. Nothing too harsh because you can leave scratch marks in the plaster if you go for something too low. Plaster bandages set within about 15 to 20 minutes. At that point they'll be quite hard to the touch, but they hold quite a lot of moisture until that evaporates out. Now you can try to speed this along with a heat gun, but the truth is the only thing you can really do is wait for it to dry out naturally. So if you sculpt and leave your piece in a colder environment, it will take a little bit longer to dry. Once it's fully dry though, you can start to paint it. These types of things often speak to me when I'm doing them, and they tell me what colour they should be as I go and what feels right. So in this process I did swap and change a little bit. When you start to paint your piece, I gave mine a base layer of white paint, and I highly recommend that you use some really good quality acrylic paints. Unfortunately, this one wasn't a very good one, and it did mean that it flaked off a little bit more when I came to distress it towards the end. I mixed my own mix of grey paint. I didn't want the ghost to be fully grey, I wanted that white to still come through, so I applied the grey on top, went over it with a wet thick brush so that it became more like a wash, and then to hide any drip or brush marks I stippled over it with a sponge, which took up any extra water but also created a smoother finish. For the eyes I wanted them to really pop, and even though there was a base coat of white, I went back in and repainted them. For the nose, I added a little bit of pink, but it was too stark, so I just blotted over it again with that sponge, which really helped to mute it down. For the eyes, I started off by doing a coat of light grey paint, but actually it wasn't really working for me and needed some more colour, so I went with this more aqua tealy type colour, which seemed to work a lot better. Next it was time to distress it. If you know me, you know I love a distressed piece, and I wanted this to look like it had been hanging around in the back of a cupboard for many years. So I hit all the high spots and overall with some sandpaper. I used 220 grit so that it wasn't too harsh, and I just worked over the piece until I was happy with it. When it came time to distress it, that acrylic paint that I used that wasn't particularly good did start to gum up, and so I had to be a little bit more careful with how I aged it, and also had to touch up the back a little bit off screen. And this is how it came out. The only trouble now is making sure that I don't eat all the candies before Halloween. Yes, that's right, I'm talking about you. Off you go. I hope you like how this ghost turned out. Let me know in the comments box below what you think, whether you'll be giving this a try, and whether or not you prefer the ghost or the cat. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. And that's the end of the video, but before you go, please help me escape the corporate 9 to 5 by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like. And if you have friends who'd like this content, be sure to share it with them. It really helps. Thanks again. Bye.